"Can you mend clothes?" The question came from the boardwalk after the mercantile door had closed in Clara Bennett's face. She stood with her sewing basket in one hand and her last clean pair of gloves in the other, the gloves folded so tightly her knuckles had gone pale beneath the worn cotton. Mrs. Hargrove had not raised her voice. That made it worse. She had only looked past Clara toward the street and said the shop had no need of another seamstress. Not this season, not any season she could see coming. Behind her, two women at the ribbon counter had stopped touching the blue satin and turned their eyes down, as if pity were something that could be hidden by looking at cloth. Clara thanked her because there was nothing else to do. She stepped outside into the late October wind, set the basket against her skirt, and moved on to the laundry, then the hotel, then the dressmaker's back door where a girl half her age told her the mistress was not taking in help from women with uncertain references. By noon, the whole town had watched her cross Main Street 3 times with the same basket and fewer places left to ask. The basket had belonged to her mother. Its lid no longer sat straight, and one hinge had been tied with brown thread years ago, but every needle inside had a place. Every spool was wrapped clean, every scrap folded flat. Clara carried it as carefully as another woman might carry silver. Near the livery, a boy's sleeve hung torn nearly from shoulder to cuff. She noticed the tear before she noticed the man beside him. Tall, hat low, work coat plain and dusted at the cuffs. He had one hand resting on the boy's shoulder and the other holding a length of broken rein. And he watched Clara not the way townspeople had watched her that morning, waiting to decide what she was worth, but the way a man looked at a fence line before repairing it. The boy whispered something. The man did not answer him right away. Clara passed them with her chin level. At the boarding house, Mrs. Pike let her in through the kitchen instead of the front room and said supper would be extra if Clara stayed another night. Clara nodded, climbed the narrow stairs, and set her sewing. Basket on the bed beside the small carpet bag already packed beneath the window. The afternoon light came through the glass thin and gray. She counted her coins twice. Enough for 1 ticket east if she did not eat breakfast. Down in the yard, someone hammered a loose board back into place. 3 steady strikes. Then silence. Clara opened the basket, touched the bent hinge with her thumb, and closed it again. She would leave before sunrise. No one in town had asked what her hands could do. They had only decided what her name was worth. Clara did not sleep so much as keep still until the room turned from black to the faint blue of morning. The boarding house had settled around her in the hours before dawn, pipes ticking in the walls, someone coughing once down the hall, the kitchen stove being coaxed awake below. She dressed in the dark, pinned her hair without lighting the lamp, and folded her spare blouse into the carpet bag with the care of a woman who had very little and could not afford to wrinkle any of it. The sewing basket went last. She set it on top instead of beside the bag, then changed her mind and carried it in her hand. At the bottom of the stairs, Mrs. Pike was kneading dough with her sleeves rolled high. She looked at the carpet bag, then at Clara's face, and said the stage would not come until 7. Clara said she knew. Mrs. Pike wiped flour from one hand and reached for the coffee pot without asking. She poured half a cup, set it on the edge of the table, and turned back to the dough as if it had been an accident. Clara stood there a moment longer than manners required. Then she drank it hot and plain, left 2 coins beside the cup, and stepped out into the cold. Main Street had not put on its face yet. The mercantile shutters were closed. The dressmaker's sign swung lightly in the wind. Yesterday's dust lay in the wagon ruts, hardened by frost along the edges. Clara walked toward the stage office with her basket against her hip and her carpet bag pulling at her shoulder. Near the livery, the same boy from the day before stood beside a sorrel horse, tugging at the torn sleeve of his coat. The tall rancher was there, too, tightening a strap on the saddle. He looked up once, saw the bag, and finished the buckle before he spoke. He did not hurry. He did not ask where she was going. He only took the boy's sleeve between 2 fingers and studied the rip. The tear had widened overnight. A child could make it worse by breathing wrong. The rancher looked from the sleeve to the sewing basket in Clara's hand. The stage bell rang once at the far end of the street. Clara shifted the carpet bag higher on her arm. The boy stood very still, embarrassed by his own cuff. The rancher removed his hat, not grandly, just enough to meet her eyes in the morning light. "I have work at my place," he said, "if your hands are willing." Clara looked at the stage office, then at the boy's sleeve, then at the man waiting beside the sorrel without filling the silence for her. Most men in town had wanted her to explain herself before they would even look at her stitches. This one had looked at the torn cloth first. "What kind of work?" she asked. "Mending to start," he said. "Shirts, coats, saddle blankets if you know heavy thread. Meals if you are willing, but I am not hiring a cook under another name." The stage bell rang again. The driver came out with a ledger tucked beneath his arm and began calling for passengers. Clara's fingers tightened around the handle of the basket. The rancher saw it and stepped aside from the path to the stage, leaving the choice plane in the street between them. "Name is Ethan Walker," he said. "Place is 4 miles north. Pay is weekly. Room if you need it." The boy looked up at that, then down quickly. Clara noticed the way he did not protest. She also noticed the patch at Ethan's elbow, old and uneven, made by a hand that had been more determined than skilled. "I will mend the sleeve first," she said. Ethan nodded once. He led her to the livery wall where the light was better and stood with his back half turned, giving her a little privacy from the street. Clara opened the sewing basket on a barrel head. The lid wobbled on its tied hinge. Inside, the needles caught the morning like small silver teeth. She threaded one with brown cotton, folded the torn cloth edge, and set the first stitch clean. The boy watched her hands. So did Ethan, though not in a way that crowded her. 10 minutes passed. The stage driver called again. Clara kept working. When she finished, the sleeve lay flat, the seam narrow and strong enough to outlast the coat. The boy touched it with one finger. "Feels better," he said. Ethan reached into his vest and set a coin on the barrel, exact and fair. Not charity. Payment. Clara looked at the coin before she picked it up. Something in her shoulders changed, not enough for anyone else to name. Ethan lifted her carpetbag from the ground without taking the basket from her hand. "Wagon is this way," he said. Clara closed the basket and followed. The wagon left town without anyone stopping it, though Clara felt every shutter and doorway watching until the last storefront fell behind them. Ethan did not speak to fill the road. The boy sat between them with his repaired sleeve held carefully away from the wagon's side, as if the seam were something worth protecting. Past the creek, the land opened into pale grass and low hills, with fence posts running north in a line that had been mended more than once. The Walker place sat 4 miles out, plain and weathered, with a barn leaning toward usefulness instead of beauty and a house that had been kept standing by hands too busy to make it pretty. A little girl stood on the porch when the wagon rolled in. She was 8, maybe, with brown hair tied in 2 uneven ribbons and a face that had learned to wait before asking for anything. Ethan set Clara's carpetbag on the porch, then looked toward the girl. "Annie, this is Mrs. Bennett. She will be doing mending for a while." The child looked at Clara's basket first, then at Clara. "Can you fix buttons?" Clara set one foot on the porch. "If the shirt still wants them." Annie considered that as if it were a serious answer, then disappeared inside. The room beside the kitchen was small, clean, and narrow, with a cot, a washstand, a hook on the wall, and a window looking toward the clothesline. Someone had swept it recently. Someone had also set a folded quilt at the foot of the cot and a chipped cup on the washstand. Ethan stayed at the threshold. He did not step in. "Door latches from the inside," he said. "Supper is at 6. Work can wait until morning." Then he left her there with the space. Clara stood still after his boots crossed the kitchen and went out the back door. She set the carpetbag on the floor, but kept the sewing basket in her hand. The room was not home. It was not even promised shelter beyond the week. But the latch turned clean when she tried it, and the quilt smelled faintly of soap and cedar. At supper, she sat at the far end of the table after Ethan nodded toward the chair. Beans, fried potatoes, and yesterday's bread were passed without ceremony. Annie watched Clara over her cup. The boy, whose name was Caleb, kept rubbing his repaired sleeve with his thumb. After the meal, Ethan rose, carried his own plate to the basin, and stacked it there before either child could move. Clara noticed the cuff of his work coat hanging loose at the wrist, the stitching half gone from long use. He noticed her noticing. He took the coat off and laid it over the back of a chair, not asking, not assuming, just leaving work where work belonged. Later, when the house had gone quiet, Clara opened her basket on the small cot. The crooked lid leaned against the wall. She lined up her needles, chose dark thread, and began with the cuff. By first light, Ethan's coat lay folded over the kitchen chair with the cuff repaired so neatly the old cloth looked steadier than it had any right to. Clara had set it there before the stove was lit, then gone back to her small room and closed the door halfway, leaving it open enough to hear the house wake. Caleb came in first, boots careful on the floorboards, and stopped when he saw the coat. He ran one finger along the cuff, then looked toward Clara's door, but said nothing. Annie came next with one ribbon loose and the other missing altogether. Ethan entered last, carrying an armload of kindling. He saw the coat, set the wood beside the stove, and picked it up. He turned the cuff once in his hand. No praise came quickly from him. No man in that house seemed used to spending words where work could stand. He put the coat on, flexed his wrist, and nodded toward Clara when she stepped into the kitchen. "It holds," he said. She took that for what it was. After breakfast, the work began finding her. 3 shirts from Caleb, 2 with torn elbows and 1 with a missing button. A flour sack that had split down the side. A saddle blanket with fraying along one edge. Annie brought a blue dress with a hem that had been let down badly and asked if it could be made not crooked. Clara examined each piece before answering. If a thing could be mended, she said so. If it could not, she said that too. By noon, her basket sat open on the kitchen table, spools lined up in the pale window light, needles tucked into the cushion she had made from a scrap of wool. She did not ask permission to work there, but she did not spread beyond her corner either. Trust, she had learned, needed room to come closer by itself. The house changed in measures too small for anyone to name at once. Caleb's sleeve stopped catching on the woodpile. Annie's dress hung even when she stood on the porch steps and turned once to test it. The flour sack held meal again. Ethan brought in a lantern strap after supper and set it near Clara's basket with a piece of leather lace beside it, already cut to length. That was how he asked. She fixed it after the dishes were done, while Annie sat across from her pretending to sort buttons. The child sorted them by color, then by size, then by which ones looked lonely. Clara gave her a cracked white button and asked where it belonged. Annie placed it beside a brown one that had no match. "There," she said. "Now neither one is alone." Clara kept her eyes on the thread. The next morning, a cup of coffee waited beside her basket before anyone called her to breakfast. Not in her room, not hidden away. On the kitchen table, where the light was best. She stood over it a moment, hearing Ethan outside splitting wood in steady strokes and Caleb answering him from the barn. Work first, words after, if they came at all. Clara wrapped both hands around the cup before she sat. By the end of the week, the basket no longer returned to her room each night. She left it under the kitchen window, lid crooked, brown hinge thread showing, and no one moved it. Annie began coming to the kitchen before breakfast with problems that did not always need mending. A stocking with a hole no bigger than a pea. A ribbon frayed at the very end. A doll apron that had come loose only because she had tugged the thread free herself and then looked ashamed when Clara turned it over in her hands. Clara did not scold her. She showed her how to knot the thread and how to push the needle through without pricking her thumb. Annie watched with her whole face. Caleb watched from the doorway with one boot half-laced, pretending he had only stopped there by accident. On the third morning, Clara set a square of scrap cloth beside each child's plate. After breakfast, Caleb found his folded into his coat pocket with a needle already threaded through it, and Annie found hers tucked under the cracked white button she had chosen. No one called it a lesson. It became one anyway. Ethan noticed from the sink where he was rinsing his coffee cup. He said nothing. That evening, he came in from the barn carrying a small wooden box with a loose corner. He set it on the table near Clara's basket, then placed a tack hammer beside it. "For your thread," he said. The box had been swept clean. The inside smelled faintly of cedar and old nails. Clara ran her thumb along the broken corner. It had not been bought. It had been found, considered, and brought in because someone had noticed her spools rolling loose when Annie sorted buttons too quickly. She repaired the corner after supper while Ethan sharpened a draw knife by the stove and Caleb read aloud from a schoolbook in a slow, stubborn voice. Annie leaned against Clara's chair, heavy with sleep but unwilling to leave. Outside, the wind moved across the yard and pressed once at the kitchen window. Inside, the lamp held steady. The next week, Clara started rising early enough to mend before the day took over. Ethan was always already awake. Sometimes the coffee was on. Sometimes a basket of clean laundry waited near her chair, sorted by person in a way he had not done the first week. He never explained the change. He only made it easier for the work to be done. One cold morning, Clara found her sewing basket moved 6 inches closer to the window, where the light fell cleaner. The mark in the dust showed where it had been. Ethan came in with frost on his hat brim and did not look at the basket. Clara threaded her needle and did not thank him out loud. She mended his old coat again that afternoon, this time at the shoulder where the fabric had thinned. It would have been simpler to tell him it was done for. She did not. She cut a strong patch from dark wool, set it inside where it would not show, and made the stitches small. He put it on the next morning and wore it to town. Annie saw first. "You kept that coat," she said. Ethan took his hat from the peg. "It still works." Clara looked down at the cedar box beside her basket, where the cracked white button rested with the brown one that had no match. Work was still work. A room was still a room. But when Ethan left for town, he paused at the door until Caleb handed him the list Clara had written for thread, lamp oil, and 2 yards of plain muslin, as if her needs had become part of the house's errands. The first snow came early, not heavy enough to bury the yard, but enough to make the wash freeze stiff on the line and turn every chore slower. Ethan and Caleb rode out before dawn to check the north fence after a neighbor's steer broke through in the night. They left with biscuits wrapped in cloth and their collars turned high against the wind. Clara stood on the porch until the sound of the wagon faded. Then she went back inside and found Annie at the kitchen table, trying to pull her boots on over stockings too thin for the weather. The child did not complain. That was worse. Clara knelt, felt the stocking at the heel, and found the skin cold through the worn wool. She said nothing about it. She went to her basket, took out the muslin Ethan had brought from town, and cut it into lining. By noon, Annie's stockings had been reinforced, her coat sleeves lengthened with dark cloth from an old skirt, and her ribbons replaced with 2 narrow strips of blue left from a dress Clara had once hoped to wear somewhere better. Annie stood very still while Clara tied them. "Do they cost money?" she asked. "Not today," Clara said. Outside, the wind pushed hard enough to rattle the kitchen window. Clara looked toward the barn and saw the laundry line sagging, one end loose from the post. The sheets were dragging through snow and mud, and the repaired saddle blanket Ethan needed for the team was half on the ground. She put on her shawl, took the hammer from the shelf, and went out before Annie could argue. The post had split where the hook was driven in. Clara could not fix it like a carpenter, but she could make it hold until Ethan returned. She wedged a strip of scrap wood behind the hook, wrapped twine tight, and drove the nail in at a new angle. Her fingers went stiff. She kept working. When the line held, she lifted the wet sheets free and carried the saddle blanket inside, heavy against her chest. She hung it near the stove, then sat at the table and mended the torn edge while Annie watched from the hearth rug with both hands around a cup of milk. Ethan returned near dusk with snow on his shoulders and Caleb half asleep beside him. He stopped in the doorway. The kitchen was warm. The blanket was dry. Annie's sleeves reached her wrists. The line outside held. Clara's hands were red from cold, resting beside the open sewing basket. Ethan took in each thing slowly, the way he had taken in the torn sleeve that first morning. He crossed to the stove, poured coffee into a cup, and set it by her right hand. Then he took the basket's crooked lid, examined the tied hinge, and laid it carefully back where it would not fall. The next morning, Ethan hitched the wagon before breakfast and set Clara's cedar thread box on the seat beside the market basket. He did not ask if she wanted to go to town. He only stood by the wagon and waited until she came out with her bonnet tied and her sewing basket in both hands. Annie had placed the cracked white button inside it for luck. Caleb had pretended not to notice and then tucked in the brown one beside it. Main Street looked different with Ethan beside her. Not kinder, just less able to pretend she was alone. At the mercantile, Mrs. Hargrove was arranging gloves behind the counter when Clara stepped in. Her eyes moved to the basket, then to Ethan's repaired coat, then to Annie's even sleeves. "Mrs. Bennet," she said too brightly, "I hear you are taking work now." Clara kept one hand on the basket handle. "Some." Mrs. Hargrove lifted a stack of shirts from beneath the counter. "I could use a steady woman for alterations. Good pay if the work proves sound." The words landed neatly. Too neatly. Clara looked at the shirts. A month ago, she would have taken them before the sentence was finished. Ethan reached past her and set a folded paper on the counter. Not money. A list. Flour, lamp oil, coffee, thread, muslin, stove blacking, and new wool for Annie. At the bottom, in his square hand, he had written Mrs. Bennet's account with Walker Ranch. Mrs. Hargrove read it once. Her mouth closed. Ethan took off his hat. Her work has proved sound, he said. Nothing more. The shop went quiet enough for Clara to hear the ribbon spools shift when the door opened behind them. Ethan picked up the muslin Clara had chosen and laid it beside the thread. He did not touch the shirts Mrs. Hargrove had offered. He waited while Clara chose her own needles, her own cloth, and 2 small cards of buttons. Then he paid for all of it under the ranch account. Outside, he lifted the packages into the wagon and left her basket in her hands. Clara looked back through the mercantile window. Mrs. Hargrove was still standing behind the counter with the untouched shirts. Ethan climbed onto the wagon seat and gathered the reins. "We have work at home," he said. Clara set the sewing basket between them this time, not on the floor. The ride back from town was quiet, but not empty. Clara kept the sewing basket steady between them while the wagon wheels cut through thin snow and old ruts. And when the ranch came into view, Annie was already on the porch with Caleb beside her, both of them watching the road as if the wagon had been gone longer than half a day. Clara carried the muslin inside. Ethan carried the flour and coffee. Caleb took the lamp oil without being asked, and Annie reached for the buttons before Clara could set them down. Supper was simple that night. Beans, bread, and potatoes browned at the edges. Clara ate from the same table, in the same chair, with the sewing basket under the kitchen window where morning light always found it first. After dishes, Ethan went out to bring in wood. Caleb banked the stove the way he had been taught. Annie climbed onto a chair and placed the cracked white button and the brown button in the cedar box, side by side. Then Ethan came back in with a small brass hinge in his palm. He set it beside the basket, along with 2 tiny screws and the careful look of a man offering work, not sentiment. Clara moved the lamp closer. Ethan held the lid steady while she fitted the hinge. Caleb passed the screwdriver. Annie held the button box with both hands. The repair took less than 10 minutes. When Clara closed the lid, it sat straight for the first time in years. No one spoke right away. Ethan lifted the basket and placed it on the shelf beneath the kitchen window, not in Clara's room, not near her packed carpetbag, but where the coffee cups lived and where Annie's school slate leaned against the wall. Clara looked at the shelf. Then she looked toward the small room beside the kitchen, where her carpetbag still waited with its straps buckled. She crossed the room, opened the bag, and began taking things out. 1 blouse, 1 brush, 1 folded pair of gloves. Annie brought her a wooden peg for the wall. Caleb brought another. Ethan brought nothing. He only stood beside the stove in his mended coat, hands still, watching Clara hang her things where they could stay.